I've been trapped beneath the cold earth, buried alive by the man who promised to love me forever. My husband left me to die under 6 feet of dirt, with only a thin plastic tube letting in precious air. Everyone thought I was the lucky one, married to a successful doctor with a picture-perfect life. But that night in the woods changed everything, and now I know the truth about the man I married, and the strength I never knew I had. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I've always been the agreeable one, the flexible one, the one who smooths things over when tension rises. My friends call me the peacemaker, always ready with a smile and a helping hand. Teaching kindergarten in Portland fills my days with finger painting and ABC songs, the children's laughter, a constant melody I've come to cherish. I love my simple routine, the way it wraps around me like a familiar blanket. But deep down, I've wondered if I'm more than just good old Maya, the woman who never makes waves. At 34, I thought I knew who I was. A teacher, a wife, a woman who keeps the peace, even when her heart feels like a tangled mess. But that was before the camping trip, before the shovel hit the dirt, before I learned how little I understood about myself, my marriage, or the darkness hiding behind my husband's perfect smile. Daniel and I met during my last year of college. He was in medical school, already focused on becoming a heart surgeon. Everyone said we were perfect together. His ambition matched my supportive nature. His family welcomed me with expensive dinners and polite conversation that never went too deep. My own parents, simple people who ran a small bookstore in Eugene, seemed dazzled by Daniel's confidence, his precise plans for the future, the way he could charm a room full of strangers. "You've found someone who will take care of you," my mother said, squeezing my hand at our engagement party. I nodded, pleased that she approved, trying to ignore the tiny voice, wondering if I needed taking care of at all. Our wedding was exactly what Daniel wanted. 300 guests at a historic mansion, my dress chosen from the 3 options he preferred, honeymoon in Bali because it impressed his colleagues. I told myself this was what marriage meant. Compromise, flexibility, making your partner happy. When we bought our house in the West Hills, Daniel handled everything. When we furnished it, his interior designer chose each piece. When we planned our lives, his career set our path. "You're so lucky," my friend Rachel said over coffee one day. "Daniel handles all the stressful decisions." I smiled and agreed, pushing down the unsettling feeling that I wasn't making any decisions at all. The first 3 years of marriage flowed smoothly enough. Daniel's surgical career took off, his reputation growing with each successful operation. I continued teaching, loving my classroom even as Daniel suggested I could quit, that we didn't need my modest teacher's salary. But my kindergartners kept me grounded in a way that Daniel's world of hospital politics and dinner parties never could. The cracks appeared slowly, hairline fractures in our perfect facade. It was the way Daniel would correct me at dinner with friends, his voice pleasant but his eyes cold. "What Maya means is," he would say, before explaining what I apparently meant better than I could myself. It was how he organized my closet while I was visiting my parents, discarding clothes he found unprofessional or childish. It was the careful way he monitored my friendships, always asking who I'd spoken to, what we'd discussed. "I just want to be part of your whole life," he explained when I questioned him. "Isn't that what marriage is about?" His logic always sounded reasonable, and I would end up apologizing for questioning his intentions. The camping trip was Daniel's idea, which surprised me. He wasn't the outdoorsy type. He preferred 5-star hotels and pressed linens. But he came home one Friday with expensive camping gear and a gleam in his eye. "Just us in the wilderness," he said, his smile wide but somehow not reaching his eyes. "No distractions, no interruptions. Wouldn't that be perfect, Maya?" I should have noticed how he emphasized no interruptions, how he chose a remote spot in the Mount Hood wilderness, how carefully he packed the car while refusing my help. But I was too busy feeling hopeful that this trip meant reconnecting, finding the man I'd fallen in love with before promotions and pressure had changed him. The forest welcomed us with cathedral-like silence, tall pines stretching toward the clouds. Daniel seemed relaxed for the first time in months, as he expertly set up our tent, built a fire, and unpacked the cooler of food he'd prepared. We hiked through the afternoon, the September air crisp against my skin. For a few precious hours, it felt like we were finding each other again in the quiet of the woods. As twilight settled around our campsite, Daniel opened a bottle of wine. "A toast," he said, pouring me a generous glass. "To new beginnings." The wine tasted oddly bitter, but I sipped it anyway, not wanting to spoil our newfound harmony. Within 30 minutes, the trees began to spin around me, my limbs heavy as stone. I remember Daniel's face leaning over mine, all pretense of warmth gone. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said, his voice distant as I struggled to keep my eyes open. "But you've left me no choice." The world went black, my consciousness swallowed by whatever he'd put in my wine. When I woke, the terror was immediate and all-consuming. Dirt surrounded me, pressed against my body from all sides. Only my face remained uncovered. A small pocket of space with a thin plastic tube extending upward. My only source of air. I tried to scream, but could barely draw breath. I tried to move, but was pinned by the weight of the earth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel's voice came through the tube, calm and clinical. "The sedative should be wearing off now. I wanted you awake for this part." A pause, the sound of his breathing. "You know, Maya, you really brought this on yourself. If you hadn't been so suspicious, if you hadn't started asking questions about the hospital finances, if you hadn't called Rachel after finding those files, well, we wouldn't be here." My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words through my panic. The files. He meant the documents I'd found hidden in his home office last week. Papers showing massive transfers from the hospital's charitable foundation to offshore accounts. I'd only mentioned it once to Rachel, my voice low as we walked through the park. "By tomorrow morning, you'll have used up the oxygen in this little space," Daniel continued, his voice matter-of-fact, as if explaining a medical procedure. "It will be peaceful, like falling asleep. The rangers won't find this area for weeks, maybe months. And by then, I'll be the grieving widower, whose wife wandered off during a camping trip and never returned." The tube went silent. I heard the crunch of his footsteps moving away, leaving me alone with the earth pressing down and my thoughts spiraling into darkness. Time lost all meaning underground. Minutes stretched like hours as I struggled against the panic threatening to consume me. Each breath felt precious, the air growing staler with every passing moment. The darkness was absolute, pressing against my eyes until I could no longer tell if they were open or closed. I thought about my life, how I'd allowed myself to become smaller and smaller to fit into the spaces Daniel permitted, how I'd mistaken his control for care, his possessiveness for passion, how I'd ignored the warning signs, the way friends gradually stopped calling, how my parents seemed uncomfortable around him but never said why. Memories surfaced. Daniel insisting I use my teaching degree instead of pursuing the environmental law program I'd been accepted to. "You're so good with children," he'd said, "and the hours will let you keep our home beautiful." The way he'd managed our finances, giving me an allowance while handling all major decisions. How he'd smiled coldly when I mentioned having children, saying, "Let's wait until you're more mature." As oxygen grew scarce, anger replaced fear. I'd spent my life being agreeable, avoiding conflict, smoothing rough edges. Now buried in the earth by the man who vowed to cherish me, I felt decades of suppressed rage ignite like a wildfire. If these were to be my final hours, I would not spend them in fear. I would fight. The tube providing air was thin PVC, the kind used in simple plumbing projects. I realized it was my only tool, my only connection to the world above. With painstaking effort, I managed to shift my head slightly, getting my teeth around the edge of the tube. The plastic was hard but not impossible to damage. I bit down, feeling it crack slightly between my teeth. Hours passed as I worked the tube, weakening it section by section. My jaw ached. My lungs burned with the thinning air, but I continued. Finally, with one last desperate effort, I bit through the tube completely, separating a 6-inch section. The remaining tube fell away, presumably collapsing under the weight of the dirt above. Now I had something hard, something with an edge. Summoning strength I didn't know I possessed, I began scraping at the dirt around my face, creating small crumbles that I could move aside. The process was agonizingly slow, each tiny success followed by more dirt falling into the space I'd cleared. But I kept going, my movements growing weaker as the air quality deteriorated. Just as spots began dancing before my eyes, I felt something different. A root. A tree root had grown into the space near my burial site. With the last of my strength, I worked my hand toward it, fingers trembling as they wrapped around the woody lifeline. The root was alive, connected to the world above. Where there was one root, there would be more. Following the network of roots, I created a tiny tunnel, just enough to let fresh air seep through. The first breath of forest air felt like resurrection, oxygen flooding back into my desperate lungs. With renewed strength, I continued to work, widening my breathing space bit by bit. Night must have fallen because the temperature dropped dramatically. I shivered in my earthen prison, but the cold brought clarity. Daniel would expect me to be dead or dying by now. He wouldn't return to check. His plan relied on my disappearance, not the discovery of my body. That meant I had time. Not much, but some. Through the night, I worked. Every muscle screamed with the effort, but I kept digging, following the root system upward. By what must have been morning, I had created a space large enough to move my head and shoulders. With each small victory, my determination grew. I was no longer just surviving. I was fighting back. The ground above me was looser than the compacted earth Daniel had used to bury me. He'd chosen this spot carefully, I realized, beneath a natural depression where the soil was already disturbed. But that same feature was now my salvation. As I pushed upward, the earth began to give way more easily. After what seemed like eternity, my hand broke through to the surface. The sensation of cool morning air on my skin brought tears to my eyes. With one final, desperate surge of effort, I pulled myself upward, emerging from the ground like some primal creature being born. The forest around me was quiet, dawn light filtering through the trees. I lay on the ground, filthy and trembling, drawing deep breaths of sweet air into my abused lungs. My clothes were torn, my fingernails broken and bleeding from digging. But I was alive. Despite everything Daniel had done, despite his perfect plan, I had survived. I knew I couldn't stay there. Daniel might return, or hikers might find me and report back to rangers. Rangers who would contact my emergency contact, my husband. With shaking legs, I stood, orienting myself in the wilderness. Our campsite had been near a stream. I could hear it gurgling nearby. Water would be my first priority, then finding my way to safety. The stream's cold water revived me further as I washed the dirt from my face and hands, drinking deeply despite the silty taste. Looking at my reflection in a calm pool, I barely recognized myself. My eyes held a hardness that had never been there before, my face gaunt with effort and fear. But there was something else too, a strength I'd never acknowledged, now unmistakable. Our campsite was abandoned, the tent and supplies gone. Daniel had cleared out, probably driving back to Portland to begin his performance as the distraught husband. He'd report me missing, organize search parties, play the grieving widower while secretly knowing exactly where I was, or where he thought I was. The knowledge gave me a strange advantage. Everyone would be looking for a lost hiker, not a woman escaping her murderous husband. I searched the campsite perimeter, hoping Daniel had overlooked something useful. Behind a fallen log, I found our fire pit, hastily covered with leaves. Digging through the debris, my fingers touched something plastic. My water bottle, partly melted but still intact. More importantly, inside it was my car key, which I'd placed there during our hike to avoid losing it in the woods. The discovery hit me like a thunderbolt. Daniel had taken the camping gear but had missed my key. He'd driven us here in his luxury SUV, but my small Honda was parked at our house in Portland. If I could get back to civilization, I could reach our house before he expected me to, before he had time to cover all his tracks. With the key clutched in my hand like a talisman, I set off toward the main trail. Mount Hood National Forest was vast, but we'd only driven about 2 hours from Portland. If I could reach a ranger station or campground, I could find help, but not the kind Daniel would expect. Not search parties looking for a lost hiker, but police officers investigating attempted murder. The forest seemed to help me now, the same wilderness that had nearly become my grave offering paths and berries and streams for drinking. Years of occasional hiking with my school's outdoor education program had taught me basic navigation. By following the water downstream, I eventually reached a marked trail. Hours later, exhausted and limping, I emerged at a small campground where a family was packing up their RV. Their shock at my appearance was immediate. Clothes caked with dirt, face scratched, hair matted with soil. "Please," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse, "I need to get to Portland. My husband tried to kill me." The woman's eyes widened while her husband stepped protectively in front of their children. For a moment I feared they thought I was deranged, a forest madwoman sprouting wild tales. Then the woman nodded decisively. "Get in," she said, opening their RV door. "We'll take you to the ranger station. They can call the police." But I shook my head. "No rangers. He'll be monitoring emergency channels. Police reports. He's expecting me to be found days from now, if ever. My only chance is to surprise him." They exchanged concerned glances, clearly debating whether helping me was dangerous. Finally, the husband spoke. "We're heading back to Gresham. We can drop you wherever you need in Portland." The ride down the mountain was surreal, my body crammed into their small RV bathroom to clean up, while their children peeked curiously at me from behind their mother. The woman, Linda, gave me clean clothes and a sandwich that I devoured in seconds. Her husband, Mark, made calls from the driver's seat, his voice low. "My brother's a detective in Washington County," he explained. "Not Portland police, so your husband won't have connections there. He's going to meet us." I wanted to protest. Any official involvement seemed risky, but exhaustion was catching up with me. The detective, a stocky man named Dave, met us at a gas station on the outskirts of Portland. His eyes were kind but professional as he listened to my story, taking notes but asking few questions. "We need evidence," he said finally. "Your word against a respected surgeon's won't be enough. Those financial documents you mentioned, if we can find those, we have a case." "They're in his home office," I said, "hidden in a false bottom of the filing cabinet." "But he'll have moved them by now." Dave shook his head. "Maybe not. He thinks you're still buried in the forest. He won't expect anyone to search the house for days, maybe weeks. We have a window of opportunity, but it's closing fast." A plan formed quickly. Dave couldn't execute an official search without a warrant, which would take time and alert Daniel through his hospital connections. But I still had my key. I could enter my own home legally, retrieve the evidence, and bring it out. "It's dangerous," Dave warned. "If he's there, he won't be," I said with certainty. "He'll be at the hospital, establishing his alibi, making sure everyone sees him working normally before reporting me missing tonight or tomorrow." The drive to our West Hills home was tense, Dave following discreetly, in an unmarked car. The house looked exactly as we'd left it 2 days ago, perfect and untouched, like a museum exhibit of successful living. My key turned in the lock, the familiar click both comforting and terrifying. Inside, the house was silent. I moved quickly to Daniel's office, the room he'd always kept locked, the room I'd only entered once before, when curiosity overcame my habitual obedience. The filing cabinet stood in the corner, expensive brushed steel matching the minimalist decor. The false bottom was cleverly designed, invisible unless you knew to look for it. Inside were USB drives, folders of documents, and a small notebook filled with Daniel's precise handwriting. I gathered everything, stuffing it into a bag I'd grabbed from the kitchen. As I turned to leave, I heard it. The garage door opening. Daniel was home. My blood turned to ice as footsteps approached the front door. There was no time to call Dave, no time to escape through the front. Moving on instinct, I slipped into the coat closet near the entryway, pulling the door closed just as Daniel entered. Through the slats, I watched my husband move through our home. He looked completely normal, handsome in his scrubs, his movements confident. This was the man who had drugged me, buried me alive, and left me to die. This was the man now opening a bottle of wine, his expression peaceful, perhaps even relieved. My phone was still in the bag he'd taken from the campsite, but there was a landline on the table near the closet. If I could reach it without being seen, I could alert Dave. As Daniel moved toward the kitchen, I eased the closet door open, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he would hear it. The landline was just 3 steps away. I took one step, then another, my movements silent on the thick carpet. Just as my fingers touched the phone, Daniel spoke. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Maya." He stood in the kitchen doorway, a glass of wine in one hand, his expression mildly curious, as if finding his supposedly buried wife in their living room was only a minor surprise. "How did you get out?" he asked, his tone conversational. "That's actually impressive." I calculated the oxygen supply very precisely. My hand still on the phone, I stared at this stranger wearing my husband's face. "You missed something in your calculations," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You thought I was weak." A flicker of annoyance crossed his features. "Put the phone down, Maya. We can discuss this rationally." "Like you rationally decided to murder me?" The evidence bag felt heavy against my side. "I found the documents, Daniel. I know what you've been doing with the hospital foundation money." His expression hardened. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Put down the phone and the bag, and maybe we can work something out." "There's nothing to work out." My finger found the emergency button on the phone. "It's over." He moved with surprising speed, crossing the room in 3 long strides, but the front door burst open before he reached me. Dave entered with his weapon drawn, 2 uniformed officers behind him. "Daniel Whitaker," Dave said, his voice calm but authoritative, "you're under arrest for attempted murder and financial fraud." The look on Daniel's face as the officers handcuffed him was one I'll never forget. Not rage or fear, but genuine confusion, as if the world had suddenly stopped following the rules he'd established. As they led him away, he looked back at me once. "You were never supposed to fight back," he said softly. "That wasn't who you were." I met his gaze steadily. "You never knew who I was." The days after Daniel's arrest passed in a blur of police statements, legal consultations, and shocked reactions from friends and family. I sat in my living room, now emptied of Daniel's presence but still haunted by his shadow, as Detective Dave explained what they'd found. "The financial fraud was just the beginning," he said, his voice gentle as he spread documents across my coffee table. "The foundation money was being funneled into experimental medical procedures, unauthorized treatments on patients who didn't know what they were really consenting to." I stared at the papers, seeing Daniel's precise handwriting detailing outcomes, complications, deaths marked with clinical detachment. My stomach churned. "There were others before you," Dave continued. 2 women who got too close to his operations. They were reported as hiking accidents, drowning victims. We're reopening those cases now. The truth hit me like a physical blow. Daniel hadn't just tried to kill me on impulse. He'd done it before, had perfected his method. The camping trip, the remote location, the careful planning, all rehearsed, all calculated. "Why did he marry me?" I whispered, the question that had haunted me since emerging from the earth. If he was doing all this, why choose a kindergarten teacher who had nothing to do with his medical world? Dave's expression softened. "From what we've gathered, you were his cover, the perfect, supportive wife who helped present him as a respectable, caring doctor. And you were," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "unlikely to challenge him. At least, that's what he thought." The words stung, but I couldn't deny their truth. Daniel had chosen me precisely because I was accommodating, because I avoided conflict, because I had been trained my whole life to smooth things over rather than stand my ground. I looked around at the house Daniel had selected, the furniture he'd chosen, the life he'd constructed with me as an accessory. Every corner reflected his controlling presence. Even now, with him in jail awaiting trial, I felt suffocated by the weight of the perfect life he'd built to conceal his crimes. "I can't stay here," I said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as the words left my mouth. "You don't have to," Dave assured me. "We can help you find somewhere safe until the trial." But I shook my head. "No, I mean I can't stay in Portland. In this life. I need to go somewhere where no one sees me as Daniel's wife, or the victim of that awful burial, or poor Maya who never noticed she was married to a monster." Dave nodded slowly. I understand, but where will you go? The question hung in the air as I realized I had no answer. My entire adult life had been shaped around Daniel's plans, Daniel's preferences. Without him, I felt both liberated and terrifyingly unmoored. My parents offered their home in Eugene, their voices strained with guilt for not seeing through Daniel's charm. Friends extended couches and spare rooms, their eyes wide with the morbid fascination of those who've discovered their proximity to horror. Every option felt like a retreat, a hiding place. That night, alone in the guest bedroom where I'd been sleeping since my return, unable to bear the master bed I'd shared with Daniel, I scrolled through news articles about my case. The headlines were sensationalist. Dr. Barry's wife alive. Surgeon's deadly deception. Woman escapes grave in wilderness. One phrase caught my eye in a smaller local paper. Phoenix Rising. Teacher survives burial to expose husband's crimes. Phoenix Rising. The image resonated deep within me. I'd been buried, not just physically in the forest floor, but for years beneath Daniel's control and my own acquiescence. Yet somehow I'd broken free of both. I thought of the moment my hand had pushed through the soil, reaching toward the sky. The desperate, triumphant feeling as I pulled myself from the earth. I didn't want to retreat from that strength. I wanted to build on it. The answer came at dawn, as light filtered through the unfamiliar curtains of the guest room. My cousin Elise lived in Sedona, Arizona, running a small wellness retreat in the Red Rock landscape. We drifted apart during my marriage. Daniel had found her too spiritual, too ungrounded, but she'd called immediately after the news broke, offering support without judgment. "Come here," she'd said simply. "The desert heals." At the time, I'd thanked her politely but non-committally. Now, watching the sunrise paint the walls gold, her offer felt like more than a kind gesture. It felt like a path forward. I called her immediately, despite the early hour. "That place you offered," I said when she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Is it still available?" "Always," she replied without hesitation. "When are you coming?" 2 weeks later, I stood in the Portland airport, a single suitcase containing everything I wanted to keep from my old life. I'd sold the house, the furniture, Daniel's car. My attorney was handling the divorce proceedings in my absence. The money from the sale was frozen pending the outcome of Daniel's trial. But I had my teacher's savings and a surprising sense of freedom in traveling light. The small house on Elisa's property was simple but beautiful, an adobe structure nestled against rust-colored cliffs. Floor-to-ceiling windows brought the desert inside, the landscape a constant presence that made human concerns seem appropriately sized. "It's too much," I protested when she showed me the space, sunlight streaming across the polished concrete floors. "It's exactly enough," Elise countered, her eyes kind but brooking no argument. "The guest instructors usually stay here, but we're between programs. Stay as long as you need." The first week, I barely left the house. I slept for hours, my body finally processing the trauma it had endured. When awake, I sat on the small patio, watching lizards dart across rocks, hawks circle overhead. The desert had a stark honesty that comforted me. Nothing hidden, everything exposed to the relentless sun. Elise checked on me daily but never pushed. She left books on healing, on trauma, on rebuilding. Some I read hungrily, others I couldn't yet face. She brought simple meals and sat in companionable silence, never demanding conversation, but always ready if I wanted to talk. It was during one of these quiet evenings, the desert cooling as stars emerged in startling profusion, that I finally asked her the question that had been haunting me. How did I not see it? All those years, living with him, sleeping beside him. How did I miss who he really was? Elise considered the question carefully, her face thoughtful in the gathering dusk. People like Daniel excel at creating perfect facades. But Maya, she reached for my hand, you also weren't looking. You'd been taught your whole life to accommodate, to adjust, to smooth things over. The observation hit with painful accuracy. My parents' marriage was like that, I admitted. Mom always giving in, always keeping the peace. I thought that's what a good wife did. It's what many women are taught, Elise agreed. But buried alive is no way to live. Whether it's under actual dirt, or under someone else's expectations. Her words echoed in my mind long after she'd gone back to her own house. Buried alive, I'd survived the physical burial, but I'd been buried in other ways for most of my life. Under politeness, under accommodation, under the belief that keeping others happy was more important than hearing my own voice. The next morning, I woke with the desert sunrise and did something I hadn't done since arriving in Sedona. I stepped beyond the property boundaries. The hiking trail behind Elise's retreat wound through red rock formations, juniper trees providing occasional shade. Each step felt deliberate, my body remembering its strength. At a viewpoint overlooking a vast canyon, I stopped, the morning sun warming my face. Below, the landscape stretched in magnificent indifference to human concerns. I took a deep breath, feeling the desert air fill my lungs, and made a promise to myself. I would never again be buried, not by dirt, not by someone else's control, not by my own fear of conflict. When I returned, Elise was leading a small yoga class on the retreat's main deck. She waved me over, but I hesitated, suddenly conscious of my sweat-dampened clothes and wild hair. "Join us," she called. "No experience necessary." The old Maya would have declined, embarrassed to be unprepared, to potentially disrupt others' experience. Instead, I stepped onto an empty mat at the back of the class. My movements were awkward, my balance uncertain, but with each pose, each breath, I felt more present in my own body, the body that had fought its way out of the grave. After class, a woman with silver hair and deeply tanned skin approached me. "You're Elise's cousin," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Sophia. I teach wilderness survival here." I couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped. "I could have used your class a month ago." Sophia's eyes held no pity, only a keen assessment. "Elise told me what happened. Surviving being buried alive with no training? That's not luck. That's exceptional instinct and will." Her words caught me off guard. I'd been thinking of my survival as desperate luck, not skill or strength. Have you ever considered that what happened to you, terrible as it was, revealed something important about yourself? Sophia asked. Something that might help others? I shook my head, confused. What do you mean? Our next workshop series needs another instructor, she explained. We teach women self-reliance in the wilderness, but also in life. Your story, your experience, it could be powerful for participants to hear. The suggestion seemed absurd. I'm a kindergarten teacher, I protested. I'm not qualified to teach survival skills. Sophia's laugh was like wind through dry grass. You survived being buried alive and then exposed a murderer. I'd say you're uniquely qualified to teach about both physical survival and breaking free from controlling relationships. The idea settled into me slowly, taking root like the desert plants that somehow thrived in seemingly impossible conditions. That night I couldn't sleep, Sophia's suggestion playing through my mind on repeat. Me, teaching women to survive, to stand up for themselves? The woman who had spent years accommodating a controlling husband? But then I remembered the moment underground when anger had replaced fear. The clarity I'd found in fighting for my life. The strength that had always been there. Buried under layers of accommodation and peacekeeping. The next morning I sought out Sophia, finding her checking equipment in a small outbuilding. If I did this, I said without preamble, what would it look like? Her smile was immediate. You'd share your story, yes, but more importantly, you'd help women recognize the patterns of control in their own lives. You'd teach them that survival isn't just physical. It's about recognizing your own power, your own voice. I'm still figuring that out myself, I admitted. The best teachers are always students too, Sophia replied, handing me a compass from her collection. Learning to find true north is a lifelong practice. Over the following weeks, I began training with Sophia and the other instructors. They taught me practical wilderness skills, fire building, shelter construction, navigation, but also helped me articulate the emotional journey I'd been through. With each passing day, I felt my confidence growing, my voice strengthening. The first workshop I assisted with was small, just 8 women ranging in age from 25 to 63. They came for different reasons, some seeking adventure, others healing from their own traumas, all looking for something they couldn't quite name. On the second night, around a carefully built campfire in the desert, Sophia nodded to me. Maya has a story to share, she said simply, then fell silent. The women's faces turned toward me, firelight casting shadows that made them look both vulnerable and fierce. I took a deep breath and began speaking, not the sensationalized version from news headlines, but the true story. The years of small accommodations, the gradual erasure of my own desires, the moment underground when I realized I had always been stronger than I believed. When I finished, the silence was profound. Then one woman, a lawyer named Janet, who had barely spoken during the trip, cleared her throat. I've never been buried alive, she said, her voice rough with emotion. But I haven't taken a breath that felt truly mine in 15 years. My husband hasn't put his hands on me, but he's buried me in criticism, in isolation, in fear. One by one, the other women spoke, each recognizing some element of burial in their own lives, under expectations, under relationships, under the weight of always putting others first. As the stories flowed, I realized that what had happened to me in its extreme physical form was a manifestation of what happens to many women in subtler, insidious ways. That night, sleeping under the vast desert sky, I dreamed of the forest where Daniel had buried me. But in the dream, as I emerged from the earth, I wasn't alone. Women rose from the ground all around me, helping each other stand, brushing dirt from each other's shoulders, forming a circle of survivors. I woke with the first light, the dream still vivid. Grabbing my journal, I began writing feverishly, not just about what had happened to me, but about what it meant. About the strength that lives in us even when we've been trained not to recognize it. About how the journey out of the grave is both literal and metaphorical for so many women. When the retreat ended, the participants asked when I would lead my own workshop. The question startled me. I still saw myself as a beginner, still learning. You're ready, Sophia insisted later as we cleaned equipment. Not because you have all the answers, but because you're asking the right questions. 3 months after arriving in Sedona, I led my first solo workshop, Unearthed, Finding Strength After Trauma. It filled within days of being announced, mostly with women from the local area, many referred by previous participants. The work was challenging but fulfilling in a way teaching kindergarten had never been. I still loved children, still missed my classroom sometimes, but this new path felt aligned with the person I was becoming, the person who had always been there, buried under layers of accommodation. As my workshops gained attention, a small publisher approached me about writing a book. The idea was terrifying. Putting my story, my journey in permanent form for strangers to judge. The old Maya would have declined politely, worried about doing it imperfectly, concerned about what others might think. Instead, I said yes. Each morning, I sat at the small desk in my adobe house, watching the sun illuminate the red rocks as I wrote about darkness and light, about being buried and breaking free. The writing was often painful, forcing me to revisit moments I'd rather forget, but also healing, allowing me to recognize my own growth. 6 months into my desert rebirth, as I was completing the manuscript, Dave called with news. Daniel's trial was scheduled. The prosecutor wanted me to testify. You don't have to, Dave assured me. The evidence is strong without your testimony. But putting a face to the crime, letting the jury hear directly from you, it could make a difference in sentencing. The thought of seeing Daniel again, of being in the same room with the man who had put me in the ground, sent ice through my veins. But I thought of the women from my workshops, the ones who had found their voices after years of silence. I thought of what I taught them about facing fears, about standing in their truth. I'll be there, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. The courtroom in Portland was crowded, journalists and spectators packed into every available seat. I sat straight-backed on the witness stand, my gaze fixed on the prosecutor rather than on Daniel, who sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, his expression carefully neutral. Ms. Reynolds, the prosecutor began, using my maiden name which I had reclaimed, could you tell the court what happened on the night of September 8th last year? I took a deep breath and began speaking, my voice clear in the hushed courtroom. I described the camping trip, the drugged wine, waking underground. As I spoke of digging myself out, I allowed myself a single glance at Daniel. His eyes widened slightly. Perhaps this was the first time he'd heard exactly how I'd escaped the grave he'd placed me in. The defense attorney tried to paint me as confused, suggested I might have misinterpreted an accident, implied I was seeking attention or financial gain. With each question, I felt an old familiar urge to accommodate, to smooth things over, to make myself smaller, to avoid conflict. Instead, I met his gaze directly. "I know exactly what happened to me," I said firmly. "I know exactly who put me in that grave. And I know exactly why I'm here today, to ensure no other woman experiences what I did." When the verdict came 3 days later, guilty on all counts, with a sentence that ensured Daniel would never practice medicine again, never walk free to harm another woman, I felt no triumph, only a quiet completion. A chapter ending, making room for the rest of my story to unfold. Back in Sedona, my book was published to unexpected attention. Unearthed, How I Survived Being Buried Alive and Found My True Strength became a bestseller, not for its sensational elements, but for its honesty about transformation, about finding power in the darkest places. Media requests poured in, talk shows, podcasts, speaking engagements. The old Maya would have been overwhelmed, hesitant, self-effacing. The new Maya, the one who had clawed her way through earth toward light, considered each opportunity carefully, accepting those that felt aligned with her purpose, declining those that seemed exploitative. On a clear desert evening 1 year after my escape, I sat with Elise and Sophia on my patio, sharing wine that tasted only of grapes and friendship. The sun set behind the red rocks, painting the sky in impossible colors. "Did you ever imagine this is where you'd be?" Elise asked, gesturing to the peaceful scene, so different from the controlled perfection of my life with Daniel. I thought about the question, about the strange, terrible journey that had led me here. "No," I admitted, "but I think perhaps this is where I was always meant to be. I just had to be buried to find my way to the surface." My book tour took me across the country, from intimate bookstores with folding chairs to university auditoriums filled to capacity. Each venue brought new faces, new stories of women recognizing their own buried selves in my words. I stood at podiums in cities I'd never visited before, my voice growing stronger with each retelling, each question answered, each hand shaken afterward. "Did you ever forgive him?" This question came frequently, usually whispered by someone lingering after the formal signing ended. My answer evolved over time, becoming more nuanced as I worked through my own healing. "Forgiveness isn't my obligation," I would say, "but I've released the anger that once kept me tethered to him." That's not forgiveness. It's freedom. In Chicago, during a particularly heavy snowstorm that left only the most determined attendees huddled in a bookstore's back room, a woman with tired eyes and fidgeting hands approached me. "My husband hasn't buried me physically," she said, her voice barely audible above the howling wind outside. "But I recognize myself in your story. I've been disappearing for years, becoming smaller, quieter, less me. I'm afraid of what happens if I try to dig myself out." Her words struck me deeply. I took her hands in mine, feeling the slight tremble in her fingers. "The scariest moment isn't being buried," I told her. "It's that first decision to fight back, to reclaim your space. But I promise you, the air is sweeter above ground." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. 2 months later, she emailed me. She'd left her husband, was staying with her sister, had applied to finish the degree she'd abandoned years ago when he'd convinced her it was unnecessary. "I'm breathing again," she wrote. Messages like hers arrived daily, women sharing their own journeys toward reclaiming buried selves. Some had survived physical violence, others the more insidious erosion of identity that comes from years of accommodation and self-denial. Each story reinforced what I was coming to understand, that my experience, extreme as it was, had universal elements that resonated across different lives and circumstances. The tour was exhausting but exhilarating. I found myself more comfortable with public speaking than I'd ever imagined possible. The kindergarten teacher who had once dreaded parent-teacher conferences now held audiences rapt, speaking without notes, sharing not just my story but the wisdom I'd gained through surviving it. You're a natural, my publisher's publicity director remarked after a particularly successful event in Seattle. Have you considered doing more than just book events? Motivational speaking? Workshops? Corporate training about resilience? I laughed, still sometimes surprised by these new possibilities. I'm a teacher at heart, I admitted. Just with different students now. As the tour wound down, I returned to Sedona, to the adobe house that had become home. The desert welcomed me back, with its stark beauty, its honest light. I'd been gone nearly 2 months, and returning felt like exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Elise greeted me with a warm hug and news. The retreat center expansion is finished, she said excitedly. The new workshop space can hold 30 people. We've already got a waiting list for your next program. The expansion had been a joint project. My book advance had provided capital, while Elise contributed her experience in running retreats. Together, we'd created a space specifically designed for women's healing and empowerment work. I've been thinking, I said as we toured the new space, its windows framing the red rock landscape perfectly, about expanding what we offer. Not just survival skills and trauma recovery, but preventative work too. Helping women recognize the small burials before they become graves. Elise nodded enthusiastically. Educational programs for young women? Professional development for women in challenging work environments? All of that, I agreed. And something for men, too. The enlightened ones who want to understand, who want to be part of the solution. The idea had been forming during my tour, sparked by the surprising number of men who attended my talks. Fathers concerned for daughters, partners seeking to understand wives' experiences, men grappling with their own complicity in systems that buried women's voices. They came with genuine questions, with grief, with determination to do better. One man in particular had stayed in my mind, a professor of psychology who approached me after a university lecture. I've studied trauma academically for decades, he'd said, his voice thoughtful. But I've never truly understood the everyday erosions, the small accommodations that create the conditions for larger trauma. Your book opened my eyes. Our conversation had continued over coffee, his perspective as a researcher complementing my lived experience. Dr. Adam Wilder had developed programs for college students about healthy relationships, but felt they were missing something essential. They focus on obvious red flags, he'd explained, but miss the subtle patterns that can be equally damaging over time. Your story illustrates both the horrific act of burial, but also the years of small erasures that preceded it. We'd exchanged contact information, promising to explore potential collaboration. Now back in Sedona, I reached out to him. Our first video call was professional but animated, ideas flowing as we outlined a potential curriculum. Adam's academic knowledge provided structure, while my experience added emotional resonance. By the call's end, we had the framework for a program called Unburied, Recognizing and Resisting Erasure in Relationships. This could really help people before they're in crisis, Adam said, his enthusiasm evident even through the screen. Prevention rather than just recovery. That's exactly what I'm hoping for, I agreed. Giving people tools to recognize when they're starting to disappear, when someone is taking up too much space in their life. Over the next few months, Adam made several trips to Sedona to develop the program. We worked well together, his methodical approach balancing my more intuitive style. The curriculum took shape. Workshops, exercises, discussion frameworks designed to help participants identify patterns in their relationships. During his third visit, as we sat reviewing materials on my patio, the desert sunset painting everything in gold, Adam looked up from his notes. Maya, he said hesitantly, I need to be transparent about something. My body tensed automatically, old fears surfacing. What is it? I'm finding myself attracted to you, he said simply, as more than a colleague. And given the nature of our work, given your history, I felt it was important to acknowledge that directly, to give you the opportunity to establish whatever boundaries you need. The directness of his statement, the lack of pressure or expectation, caught me off guard. Since my escape from Daniel, since the divorce was finalized, I'd had no interest in romantic relationships. The thought of being vulnerable again, of trusting someone in that way, had seemed impossible. I appreciate your honesty, I said carefully. But I'm not sure I'm ready for anything beyond our professional relationship. Adam nodded, no hint of disappointment or frustration crossing his features. I completely understand. The work we're doing is what matters most. I just didn't want anything unspoken affecting our collaboration. We returned to our notes, the moment passing without awkwardness. Yet something had shifted inside me. Not toward Adam specifically, but in my conception of what might be possible. For the first time since digging myself out of the earth, I considered that I might someday want connection again. Might someday trust enough to be vulnerable with another person. The thought was both terrifying and strangely hopeful. Our program launched 3 months later, first at the retreat center, then expanding to universities and community centers across the Southwest. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Women and men alike finding value in the frameworks we developed, in the honest conversations our curriculum facilitated. At a weekend workshop in Flagstaff, a young couple approached me during a break, the woman's eyes bright with recognition. "Your book saved our relationship," she said, her partner nodding beside her. I was disappearing, becoming someone I didn't recognize, and he was unconsciously taking up all the space. "We didn't even see it happening until I read your story." Her partner, a tall man with kind eyes, added, "We're here to learn how to be better, how to make sure we both have room to grow." Their words touched me deeply. This was exactly what I'd hoped for. Not just helping survivors heal, but preventing the slow suffocation of selves that preceded more dramatic trauma. The success of the program led to more opportunities. Consultations with domestic violence prevention organizations, speaking engagements at professional conferences, meetings with educational policymakers interested in incorporating our curriculum into school programs. As my professional life flourished, my personal healing continued. The nightmares that had once haunted me, of dirt filling my mouth, of pressure on my chest, of struggling for air, gradually subsided. I still startled at the sound of shovels hitting dirt, still preferred open spaces to enclosed ones, but these reactions no longer controlled me. Working with a trauma specialist, I learned to recognize when I was slipping into old patterns of accommodation, when I was making myself smaller to avoid conflict. I practiced speaking my truth, setting boundaries, taking up the space I deserved in the world. One evening, after a particularly intense therapy session where I'd worked through memories of the early days of my marriage to Daniel, I found myself driving to the edge of Sedona, to a viewpoint overlooking the vast canyon beyond. The sun was setting, the red rocks glowing like embers. I stood at the railing, breathing deeply, feeling the expansiveness of the landscape seep into my body. In that moment, a realization washed over me. I was no longer defined by what had happened to me. The burial, the escape, the rebuilding, they were part of my story, but they were not the whole of who I was. That night, I called Adam. Our professional relationship had continued to thrive, our program expanding to new locations, but we had maintained careful boundaries around personal interaction. "I'd like to have dinner," I said when he answered. "Not to discuss work, just dinner." His pause was brief but noticeable. "I'd like that very much," he replied, his tone warm but measured. We met at a small restaurant in Jerome, a former mining town perched on a mountainside near Sedona. The setting was neutral territory, a place neither of us had associations with. Over locally sourced food and wine, we talked about everything except our work. Books we'd read recently, places we hoped to travel, childhood memories that had shaped us. "When did you know you wanted to study psychology?" I asked as we shared dessert, the restaurant quiet around us. Adam's expression grew thoughtful. "My father was emotionally abusive to my mother," he said simply. "Not physically violent, but constantly belittling, controlling. As a child, I couldn't understand why she stayed, why she kept trying to please him. When I was 15, she finally left, and I saw her become herself again, like a plant finally getting sunlight. I wanted to understand that process, to help others through it. His honesty, his willingness to share vulnerability, touched something in me. That's why our work resonates with you so deeply, I observed. He nodded. And with you. We've both witnessed erasure, from different perspectives. As he drove me home, the desert night spread above us, stars impossibly bright against the darkness. I felt a sense of rightness, of possibility. At my door, he didn't presume to kiss me, didn't push for more than I was ready to give. Thank you for tonight, he said simply. for your trust." I smiled, feeling something unfamiliar but welcome. The fluttering beginnings of attraction without fear, of connection without loss of self. "I'd like to do it again," I replied. Our relationship developed slowly, intentionally. We discussed boundaries explicitly, checked in regularly about comfort levels, practiced the very principles we taught in our workshops. There were moments of triggering. The first time he reached for my hand in the dark, the first time his body was positioned above mine, but he met each reaction with patience and understanding. 6 months into our relationship, as we prepared for a major conference where we would present our program to educators from across the country, Adam broached a subject we'd been circling. "I've been offered a position at Northern Arizona University," he said as we reviewed our presentation slides. "A tenured professorship leading their relationship psychology department." I looked up, surprised. Adam's home base was UCLA, his position there prestigious and secure. "That's quite a change," I observed. "Are you considering it?" He met my gaze directly. "I am. For professional reasons. They're doing innovative work in trauma-informed education, but also for personal ones. Being closer to you, being able to develop our relationship without constant travel, it's appealing." The old Maya might have immediately accommodated, might have focused on his needs, his career, his desires. The Maya who had fought her way out of the earth considered more carefully. "How would this affect our power dynamic?" I asked. "You moving here for me could create an imbalance, a sense of obligation." Adam smiled, appreciation in his eyes. "I've considered that. It's why I wanted to discuss it openly, to make sure we're making decisions that keep us both whole, both autonomous." We talked for hours, examining implications, considering alternatives, ensuring that whatever decision emerged would support both our individual paths and our shared work. It was unlike any relationship conversation I'd ever had. No manipulation, no unstated expectations, no sacrifice of self for harmony. In the end, Adam accepted the position, but we agreed to maintain separate homes, separate lives, while exploring our connection. It was an arrangement that honored both our growing feelings and our hard-won independence. The national conference marked a turning point in our professional work. Educators and counselors from major universities expressed interest in implementing our curriculum. A foundation approached us about funding a broader research study on the efficacy of our prevention model. What had begun as my personal healing journey was evolving into something with potential for systemic change. During the conference's final reception, as we circulated among colleagues, a distinguished older woman with silver hair and piercing eyes approached me. "Dr. Judith Mercer," she introduced herself, extending a hand. "I head the Congressional Committee on Domestic Violence Prevention. Your work has come to our attention." My heart raced. Dr. Mercer was a legend in the field, a pioneering researcher whose work had shaped national policy for decades. "We're convening a special hearing next month," she continued, "examining preventative approaches rather than just crisis response. We'd like you to testify, to share both your personal experience and the program you've developed." The invitation was overwhelming, an opportunity to influence policy at the highest level, to potentially help millions of women I would never meet. The old Maya would have declined out of fear, out of a sense of unworthiness. The woman who had emerged from the earth knew better. "I would be honored," I replied, my voice steady. Preparing for the congressional testimony consumed the next few weeks. Adam helped me organize research data supporting our approach, while Elise and Sophia reminded me to stay connected to the emotional truth that gave my work its power. The night before I was to fly to Washington, I returned to the viewpoint where I'd had my realization months earlier. The canyon stretched before me, vast and unchanging, as the setting sun painted the sky in impossible colors. Standing there, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From a buried kindergarten teacher to a woman about to address Congress. From someone who accommodated others at any cost to someone who stood firmly in her own truth. From victim to advocate. My phone buzzed with a text from Adam. "Just wanted to say I believe in you, not just for tomorrow, but for all the tomorrows after. Go change the world." The message brought tears to my eyes, Not because I needed his validation, but because it was offered freely, without expectation or control. This was what healthy support felt like, I realized. Not a cage disguised as protection, but a genuine celebration of strength. As I drove back to my house to finish packing, I reflected on all the women who had shared their stories with me over the past 2 years. Women who had been buried in various ways. Women finding their way to the surface. Each of them had reinforced what I'd learned in that forest grave. That even in our darkest moments, when the weight above us seems impossible to move, we are stronger than we know. The congressional hearing room was intimidating. Wood-paneled walls, raised dais where committee members sat, cameras capturing every moment for public record. I took my seat at the witness table, adjusting the microphone, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing on me. Dr. Mercer introduced me with respect and gravity. Ms. Reynolds brings a unique perspective to our discussion, not only as a survivor of extreme domestic violence, but as an educator who has developed innovative prevention programs based on her insights. As I began my testimony, my voice gained strength with each word. I spoke of being buried, of fighting my way out, but more importantly, of the subtle erosions that precede physical violence. I explained our program's focus on recognition and prevention, on maintaining selfhood within relationships. The grave my husband dug for me in the forest was just the final expression of a burial that had been happening for years, I told the silent committee members. Each time I silenced my own voice to keep peace, each time I abandoned my own desires to accommodate his, I was allowing myself to be buried alive by inches. Questions followed, some thoughtful, others politically motivated, a few skeptical. I answered each one directly, neither apologizing for my perspective, nor attacking those who challenged it. This, too, was new. The ability to stand in disagreement without either collapsing or attacking. When the hearing concluded, several committee members approached to speak privately. One, a woman about my age with tired eyes, pressed my hand warmly. "My sister is in a relationship like you described," she said quietly. "Not violent yet, but the erasure, the control, it's all there. I've been trying to find words to help her see it. Today, you gave me those words." Her comment reminded me that change happens not just through policy, but through personal connections, one conversation at a time. The systems that allow women to be buried, literally or figuratively, weren't created overnight and wouldn't be dismantled in a day. But each person who recognized the patterns, who spoke up, who reached out, contributed to that dismantling. Back in my hotel room that night, I watched clips of my testimony being discussed on news programs. Strange, to see my face on national television, my words being analyzed and debated. Stranger still to realize that the grave that was meant to end my life had instead given me a platform to help others. My phone rang. Adam calling to check in after the hearing. We talked briefly, his pride evident but not overwhelming. After we hung up, I stood at the hotel window, looking out at the Washington Monument illuminated against the night sky. 2 years ago, I had clawed my way out of the earth, gasping for air, fighting for survival. Now I stood 20 stories above ground, breathing freely, my voice heard in the halls of power. The contrast was not lost on me. In that moment, I made a silent promise to all the women still buried. Under control, under fear, under societal expectations, I would keep speaking, keep teaching, keep fighting, to create a world where every woman could stand in the full light of her own truth, unburied and unafraid. Tomorrow, I would meet with educational policymakers interested in implementing our curriculum in high schools nationwide. The day after, I would join a roundtable of researchers studying the economic impacts of domestic violence. The work would continue, expanding outward like ripples from a stone thrown into water. But tonight, I simply stood at the window, feeling the solid floor beneath my feet, the open air around me, and the knowledge that I had not just survived being buried. I had risen from the grave stronger, clearer, and more determined than ever to help others do the same. 5 years after clawing my way out of the earth, I stood on a TED Talk stage, the red circular carpet beneath my feet, thousands of eyes focused on me. The spotlight felt warm on my skin as I took a deep breath and began my talk titled Rising: How to Reclaim Your Power After Being Buried. Imagine waking up in total darkness, I started, my voice clear and steady. Dirt pressing against your body from all sides. a thin plastic tube your only source of air. The voice of someone you once trusted telling you that by morning, you'll have suffocated to death. The audience was silent, captivated by the horror of that moment. Now imagine something even more terrifying, I continued. Imagine never knowing you were buried at all, never recognizing that your voice, your desires, your very self, was being slowly covered with the soil of someone else's expectations, someone else's control. That is the reality for millions of women around the world. A burial so gradual they don't even realize they're underground until they can barely breathe. My 18-minute talk wove together personal narrative and the broader patterns I'd observed working with thousands of women through our now international program. When I concluded with a call to action, for women to recognize their own burials, for men to examine how they might unknowingly contribute to them, for society to stop normalizing the erasure of women's autonomy, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Backstage, the event organizer handed me a bottle of water. "That was powerful," she said. "I've already got messages from 3 major foundations wanting to connect with you." I smiled, grateful but no longer surprised by such responses. The work had taken on a momentum of its own, growing beyond anything I could have imagined while fighting for breath beneath the forest floor. The Unburied Project, as we now called it, had expanded dramatically since my congressional testimony. What began as a workshop at Elise's retreat center had evolved into a comprehensive approach to relationship education and violence prevention. Our curriculum was being implemented in high schools and colleges across the country. Our training program had certified hundreds of facilitators to lead workshops in their own communities. Our research partnership with Northern Arizona University was producing peer-reviewed studies validating our approach. Adam and I had married 2 years earlier in a small ceremony on the edge of the Sedona Canyon that had become my place of reflection. Our vows, written together over weeks of thoughtful conversation, emphasized autonomy within connection, truth-telling over peacekeeping, and the commitment to help each other grow rather than control each other's growth. We lived in neighboring houses connected by a shared garden, a living metaphor for our relationship philosophy. Close enough for intimacy, separate enough for independence. Friends sometimes found our arrangement strange, but it worked perfectly for us, honoring both our deep connection and our hard-won self-sufficiency. After my TED Talk went viral, requests for interviews and speaking engagements flooded in. I was selective, choosing opportunities that allowed me to reach new audiences without sacrificing the direct work with survivors that kept me grounded. One such opportunity came from an unexpected source, a maximum security women's prison in California. The warden had seen my talk and recognized that many of her inmates were serving sentences for violent crimes committed against abusive partners after years of being buried alive in controlling relationships. "These women need to understand their own stories," she explained over the phone. "Not to excuse their actions, but to contextualize them, to find healing even within their circumstances." The prison visit was scheduled for early spring. As the date approached, I found myself increasingly reflective about the thin line between victim and perpetrator, about how different my own story might have been if I had taken a different path after escaping the grave. The day of the prison visit dawned clear and cool. Adam drove me to the facility, a sprawling concrete compound surrounded by razor wire. At the security checkpoint, he squeezed my hand. "Remember why you're here," he said simply. "To help them unbury themselves, even within these walls." The processing took nearly an hour. Identification verification, metal detectors, pat-downs, a barrage of rules and warnings. Finally, a stern-faced guard led me to a large room where 30 women in identical beige uniforms sat in metal chairs arranged in a circle. Their faces reflected varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and hope. The warden introduced me briefly, then stepped back, allowing me to take the lead. I moved to the center of the circle, making eye contact with each woman before speaking. "I'm not here to tell you my story," I began, surprising them. "You've probably heard it already, or some version of it. I'm here to listen to yours." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then a woman with faded tattoos and tired eyes spoke up. "I stabbed my boyfriend after he locked me in a closet for 2 days, she said flatly. "Got 20 years for it. He got 6 months for the closet thing." Tell me how understanding my story changes any of that. The rawness of her question cut through any prepared remarks I might have offered. This wasn't a TED stage or a college lecture hall. These women lived in the harshest reality of what happens when burial becomes unbearable. It doesn't change your sentence, I acknowledged, but understanding the pattern might change how you carry it. And it might help you recognize similar patterns if they appear in your future. For the next 3 hours, the women shared their stories. Brutal, heartbreaking accounts of control escalating to violence, of psychological torture more devastating than physical abuse, of the moment something inside them finally snapped. I listened without judgment, offering frameworks for understanding but never excusing or simplifying their complex realities. As our session neared its end, a young woman who had remained silent throughout finally raised her hand. Her face bore a jagged scar from temple to chin, her eyes holding wisdom beyond her years. "My counselor says I need to forgive him," she said, her voice barely audible. "The man who did this to me, who buried me in his basement for a week before I escaped and killed him with his own gun. She says forgiveness will set me free. But I'm already serving life without parole, so what kind of freedom is she talking about?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I moved closer to her, sitting in an empty chair nearby. "Forgiveness is often presented as something we owe our abusers," I said carefully, "as if their healing matters more than our own. But true forgiveness, if it comes at all, isn't about them. It's about releasing the power they continue to hold over us through our anger, our nightmares, our fear." I paused, measuring my next words. I haven't forgiven the man who buried me. I don't think I ever will. But I've stopped giving him space in my present. I've stopped letting his actions define my future. Maybe that's a different kind of freedom. Not from these walls, but from the prison he built inside your mind. The young woman held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'd like to work toward that," she whispered. As the guard escorted me out, the warden joined us, her expression thoughtful. "Would you consider developing a specific curriculum for incarcerated women?" she asked. "Something that addresses their unique circumstances?" The question sparked an idea that had been forming throughout the session. "Not just a curriculum," I replied. "A full program, part education, part trauma healing, part preparation for eventual release. And I'd like to train some of the women themselves to become facilitators." The warden raised an eyebrow. "You want inmates teaching other inmates? Who better?" I challenged gently. "They understand the reality in ways I never can. With proper training, their lived experience becomes their greatest teaching tool." That conversation launched what would become the Phoenix program, specialized unburied project workshops designed for and eventually led by incarcerated women. Over the next 2 years, it expanded to 12 facilities across 3 states, with remarkable results in reduced disciplinary incidents and improved mental health outcomes among participants. On a personal level, the prison work affected me profoundly. Each visit reminded me of how easily my story could have ended differently. If I'd had a weapon in that house when Daniel returned, if I'd chosen vengeance over escape, if the legal system had failed me, as it had failed so many of these women. "You carry their stories with you," Adam observed one night after I returned from a training session at the California facility. "I can see it in your eyes." I nodded, settling beside him on the porch swing that connected our 2 houses. "They're teaching me as much as I'm teaching them, about resilience in impossible circumstances, about finding purpose even when freedom is gone." "And about forgiveness?" he asked gently. The question made me pause. Daniel remained in prison, his appeals exhausted, his medical license permanently revoked. I had not spoken to him since his sentencing, had not responded to the letters he occasionally sent through his lawyer. In my mind, he existed as a closed chapter, a lesson learned at terrible cost. "I'm not there yet," I admitted. "Maybe I never will be." Adam nodded, accepting my truth without pushing for a different answer. This, too, was part of what made our relationship work, the space to hold contradictions, to be imperfect, to evolve at my own pace. As the Phoenix program gained recognition, an unexpected opportunity arose. A major streaming service approached me about creating a documentary series following women in the program, showcasing their journeys from victims to victimizers to healers. The prospect was both exciting and concerning. These women's stories deserved to be told, their humanity acknowledged beyond their crimes. But exploitation was a real risk, as was oversimplification of their complex realities. I brought the proposal to the women themselves, determined that they should have agency in how their stories were shared. Their response surprised me: enthusiastic support, with thoughtful conditions about consent and representation. "People need to see us as whole humans," explained Maria, one of the original participants now trained as a facilitator. "Not just our worst moments or our worst choices. If this helps one woman recognize her own burial before she ends up here, it's worth it." The resulting 6-part series, Unburied: Women, Violence, and Redemption, premiered 2 years later to critical acclaim and public conversation. It didn't shy away from the brutal realities of these women's crimes, but it contextualized them within patterns of abuse and control, while emphasizing their ongoing work toward healing and helping others. The week after the series launched, I received a letter that stopped me in my tracks. The return address was the federal prison where Daniel was serving his sentence. Unlike his previous communications, which came through his lawyer, this envelope bore his handwriting directly. For days, I left it unopened on my desk, unsure whether reading his words would strengthen me or set back my healing. Finally, on a clear desert morning, I took the letter to my canyon viewpoint and broke the seal. "Maya," it began simply, "I've watched your documentary series. I've read about your work. I've had 7 years in this cell to reflect on what I did to you and why. I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and you don't owe it. But I want you to know that your voice, the one I tried to silence forever, has reached even here. The man who buried you alive is finally beginning to understand why he needed you underground." The letter continued, detailing his participation in prison therapy programs, his gradual recognition of the pathology that had driven him to control and ultimately try to kill me. He made no excuses, asked for nothing, simply offered the recognition that my work had value even to the man who had tried to end it. I sat with the letter for hours, watching the sun move across the canyon, feeling neither triumph nor trauma, just a strange sense of completion. Daniel's acknowledgement changed nothing about what he had done, but it confirmed something I had come to believe through my work: that patterns of burial could be recognized and interrupted, even by those who had perpetrated them. I never responded to his letter, but I included it in the archive of materials we were collecting for a research center dedicated to relationship violence prevention. His words became part of the larger narrative we were building, evidence that change was possible, even in the most extreme cases. The 10th anniversary of my escape from the grave arrived on a golden September day. The Unburied Project had grown beyond anything I could have imagined during those desperate hours underground, an international organization with programs in schools, prisons, community centers, and corporate settings across 3 continents. To mark the milestone, we held a gathering at the expanded retreat center in Sedona. Women from all phases of the project attended. Early workshop participants now leading their own programs, researchers documenting our outcomes, facilitators trained in our methods, survivors finding their voices through our approach. Elise and Sophia, now in their 70s but still vital forces in the work, hosted the event in the central courtyard. Adam, who had become the research director for the project while maintaining his university position, stood beside me as I addressed the gathered community. 10 years ago, I fought my way out of the earth. I began, my voice carrying across the silent crowd. But my real journey started long before that moment. The day I first began to disappear, to accommodate, to make myself smaller for someone else's comfort. And my true liberation came not just from escaping the physical grave, but from recognizing all the ways I had allowed myself to be buried alive by inches. I looked out at the faces before me, women and men of all ages, backgrounds, and experiences, united by their commitment to recognizing and resisting burial in all its forms. What we've built together isn't just about survival, I continued. It's about creating a world where being buried alive, literally or figuratively, is no longer an acceptable risk of being in relationship. where the first shovelful of dirt is recognized and named before the grave gets any deeper. After my remarks, people mingled in the desert twilight, sharing stories and strategies, celebrating victories and supporting each other through challenges. I moved among them, still sometimes amazed that my personal nightmare had transformed into this community of healing and change. As the gathering wound down, a young woman approached me, her expression serious. "Ms. Reynolds," she said, "I'm a high school counselor in Phoenix. We've implemented your curriculum for 3 years now." I smiled, expecting the usual feedback about program impacts. Instead, she continued. "Last month, one of our students came to me after a workshop. She said her boyfriend had been isolating her from friends, checking her phone, telling her what to wear, all the early warning signs your program teaches them to recognize. She ended the relationship that week." The counselor's eyes filled with tears. 2 days later, that boy was arrested for attacking his previous girlfriend with a knife. "Your program didn't just help our student avoid control. It may have saved her life." Her words hit me with physical force. The reality that the patterns I had experienced to their deadly conclusion were being interrupted before they could escalate. That young women were recognizing burial while escape was still possible. Later that night, after the guests had departed, I walked alone to the edge of the property, where a small memorial garden had been planted. At its center stood a simple stone marker engraved with words from my book. "From the darkest burial can come the most powerful rebirth." I placed my hand on the cool stone, thinking of all the women still fighting their way toward light. In prisons, in controlling relationships, in cultures that normalized their erasure. The work would never truly be finished. There would always be more graves to prevent, more burials to recognize, more women needing to find their way to the surface. But standing there under the vast desert sky, I felt a profound sense of purpose. The man who buried me alive had intended to silence me forever. Instead, he had inadvertently given me a voice that reached around the world, a platform from which to help others recognize and resist their own burials. I thought of the Phoenix program participants, finding meaning despite their confinement. Of the high school students learning to identify red flags before relationships became dangerous. Of the couples using our frameworks to build connections based on mutual growth rather than control. My phone buzzed with a text from Adam. "When you're ready, I've got tea in the sunset waiting on our connecting porch." I smiled, grateful for this partnership that honored both our togetherness and our separateness. For this life I had built from the ashes of the one that was buried. For the strength I had discovered in my darkest, most desperate hours. Walking back toward our connected houses, I looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. 10 years ago, I couldn't see the stars, couldn't feel the breeze, couldn't imagine a future beyond the suffocating earth around me. Now I stood firmly on the ground, face turned toward the heavens, breathing deeply of the sweet desert air. This was what it meant to truly live unburied. Not just to survive, but to thrive. Not just to escape, but to create. Not just to heal, but to help others find their way to wholeness. The man who had tried to make the earth my tomb could never have imagined that instead, it would become the foundation upon which I built a life dedicated to ensuring no woman remained buried without hope of resurrection. That the grave he dug would not be my end, but my beginning. As I reached our shared garden, I saw Adam waiting, 2 steaming mugs on the small table between our matching chairs. He looked up as I approached, his expression warm but not possessive, loving but not controlling. "How are you feeling?" he asked simply. I took a moment to truly consider the question, to check in with myself as I'd learned to do through years of healing work. "Whole," I replied finally, "unburied, free." And in that moment, standing on solid ground beneath an open sky, I knew with absolute certainty that the answer was true. The woman who had clawed her way out of the earth was fully, finally home. Not in a place, but in herself. Not despite what had happened, but because of how she had risen from it, bringing others with her into the light. 15 years after fighting my way out of that forest grave, I stood before a packed auditorium at Harvard University. The Kennedy School of Government had invited me to deliver the annual Morrison Lecture on Public Service and Social Change. As I adjusted the microphone, I glanced at the audience. Policymakers, academics, students, and advocates, all gathered to hear about the transformation of personal trauma into systemic change. The most dangerous graves aren't the ones dug in forest floors, I began, my voice resonating through the hall. They're the ones embedded in our institutions, our cultural norms, our unquestioned assumptions about who deserves power and who deserves to be silenced. Over the past decade and a half, the work had evolved far beyond my personal story. The Unburied Project had become a global force for relationship education and violence prevention, with headquarters in 7 countries and programs running in thousands of schools, community centers, corporations, and prisons worldwide. What began as one woman's fight for survival had blossomed into a movement that had demonstrably reduced domestic violence rates in communities where our curriculum was fully implemented. But tonight, I wasn't here to talk about statistics or program outcomes. I was here to talk about the deeper transformation that had occurred. In me, in our approach, in our understanding of what it truly means to be unburied. When I first emerged from the earth, I continued, I thought my journey was about personal healing, about reclaiming my voice after one man tried to silence it forever. But as thousands of women shared their stories with me, as our work expanded into new contexts and cultures, I began to see that individual burial is always connected to collective burial, that my experience, extreme as it was, reflected patterns embedded in our legal systems, our economic structures, our very notions of relationship. The lecture traced the evolution of our approach from individual trauma recovery to systemic change work. I shared how prison administrators had initially resisted the Phoenix program, fearing it would foster resentment rather than rehabilitation, only to discover it reduced violence within their facilities. How corporate leaders had dismissed our workplace curriculum as irrelevant to their bottom line, until research showed it dramatically improved retention of female employees and fostered more innovative team dynamics. The systems that allow women to be buried, literally or figuratively, weren't created overnight, I told the attentive audience. They've been reinforced over centuries through laws, policies, religious teachings, media representations, and economic incentives. Dismantling them requires equally systemic approaches, equally long-term commitment. After the lecture, during the reception in a wood-paneled hall adorned with portraits of past university presidents, mostly men, I noted, a young woman approached me, her eyes bright with purpose. Ms. Reynolds, she said, extending her hand, I'm Congresswoman Eliza Chen. Your work inspired my legislation on relationship education in public schools. I recognized her name immediately. At 32, she was the youngest woman ever elected to Congress from her state, known for her fearless advocacy on gender issues. The Comprehensive Relationship Education Act, I said, smiling. It's transforming how we address these issues nationally. I'm honored to meet you. The honor is mine, she replied. Your book found me at a critical moment in college. I was in a relationship that was... She paused, searching for words, gradually burying me. Reading your story helped me recognize the pattern before it was too late. This was the most profound impact of our work, not just the programs implemented or policies changed, but the individual lives redirected before burial became too deep to escape. Every story, like Congresswoman Chen's, reinforced the value of prevention, of teaching recognition before rescue became necessary. As we continued talking, she shared her vision for expanding the legislation to include trauma-informed approaches for children who had witnessed domestic violence. These kids need specific support, she explained passionately. They're at high risk of either perpetuating or enduring similar relationships as adults. Her insight resonated deeply with our latest research findings. We should collaborate on this, I suggested. Our data could help strengthen your case for expanded funding. By the end of the evening, we had sketched the outline of a partnership that would bring the Unburied Project's expertise directly into federal policy development. As I returned to my hotel room, I reflected on how far the work had come, from a personal healing journey to a congressional initiative with potential to impact millions of children. The next morning, as I prepared to fly back to Arizona, I received an unexpected call from Adam. Though we remained partners in both life and work, he had been in Finland for the past month, overseeing the launch of our program in Scandinavian schools. Maya, his voice came through clearly despite the distance. I just got a call from the Nobel Committee. My heart skipped. And? The Unburied Project has been nominated for the Peace Prize for, quote, transformative approaches to preventing gender-based violence and fostering healthier relationship patterns globally. I sat down heavily on the hotel bed, stunned. The Nobel Peace Prize represented a level of recognition and influence I had never imagined possible. Not for my personal story, but for the collective work that had grown from it. The thousands of facilitators, researchers, advocates, and survivors who had built this movement together. Who nominated us? I asked when I found my voice. A coalition of women's rights organizations from 27 countries, Adam replied. Led by the Phoenix Program graduates who now run violence prevention work in their communities after release. Tears filled my eyes at this news. The women who had once been defined solely by their crimes women's society had written off as irredeemable, were now leading a global nomination for the world's most prestigious peace award. The burial they had experienced, both by their abusers and by the criminal justice system, had not been the end of their story. When will we know? I asked, my mind racing with implications. October, Adam replied. But Maya, regardless of whether we win, the nomination itself elevates everything we've been working toward. It validates that preventing violence in intimate relationships is central to creating peaceful societies. He was right, of course. The recognition would open doors, amplify our message, possibly accelerate adoption of our approaches in regions where we'd struggled to gain traction. But as I hung up and stared out the hotel window at the Boston skyline, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride, certainly. Gratitude for the countless people who had taken our initial work and expanded it in ways I could never have envisioned. But also a strange wistfulness, remembering the woman I had been before the burial, before the fight for survival that had defined the rest of my life. The kindergarten teacher with simple dreams, who had never imagined standing on international stages or influencing global policy. That evening, instead of flying directly back to Arizona, I made an impulsive decision to rent a car and drive to the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The forest there was different from the Oregon wilderness where Daniel had buried me. Denser, older, the trees gnarled and defiant against the harsh New England winters. But as I parked at a trailhead and began walking, the scent of pine and earth brought memories flooding back with physical intensity. I hadn't set foot in a deep forest since my escape. Desert landscapes had become my sanctuary. Open, exposed, nothing hidden from view. This deliberate return to a wooded environment was part pilgrimage, part exposure therapy, part ritual. After hiking for an hour, I found a small clearing where sunlight filtered through the canopy. I sat on a fallen log, breathing deeply, allowing myself to fully inhabit this space that resembled the site of my deepest trauma. The forest sounds surrounded me. Birds calling, leaves rustling, the occasional snap of a twig as small animals moved through underbrush. I reached down and picked up a handful of soil, letting it sift through my fingers. This earth, like all earth, had the potential to nurture or to bury. The difference lay not in the soil itself, but in the intention behind its use. For 15 years, I had been transforming the soil of my burial into ground for growth, not just for myself, but for others. The trauma had become a resource, the grave, a garden, not because burial was good or necessary, but because human resilience could transform even the darkest experiences into sources of life. As twilight approached, I stood and brushed the dirt from my hands. Before leaving the clearing, I removed a small stone from my pocket, a piece of red rock from Sedona that I'd carried with me since establishing my new home there. I placed it on the forest floor, a marker of this moment of reconciliation between my past and present. Thank you, I whispered to the forest, to the earth, to the younger self who had fought so desperately to survive. Thank you for showing me my strength. Back in Sedona 2 days later, I was greeted by a flurry of activity. News of the Nobel nomination had leaked, bringing interview requests, congratulatory messages, and renewed interest in our work. The staff at our headquarters, now a beautiful campus of sustainable buildings nestled against the red rocks, moved with excited purpose, responding to the increased attention while maintaining focus on our core programs. Elise, now in her 80s but still serving as an elder advisor to the organization, met me at my office door, her eyes bright with pride. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, embracing me warmly, "when you first showed up here with nothing but trauma and determination, that it would lead to this?" I shook my head, remembering those early days. The confusion, the anger, the gradual awakening to purpose. Never. I was just trying to understand what had happened to me, to make some meaning from it. "And in doing so, you've helped thousands make meaning of their own experiences," she said, linking her arm through mine as we walked toward the main meeting room. That's how transformation works. Personal becomes political, becomes possible. Inside, the leadership team had gathered to discuss our response to the nomination. The faces around the table reflected the global nature our work had taken. Directors from our programs in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America connected via video conference alongside the core team based in Sedona. Sophia, still vital in her 80s, had stepped back from daily operations but remained our spiritual center. "The nomination changes nothing about the work itself," she reminded everyone, her voice strong despite her years. "It simply creates more opportunities to do it. Let's remember why we began, not for recognition, but for liberation." Her grounding perspective set the tone for our planning. Rather than being distracted by the prestige of the nomination, we focused on how to leverage the attention to advance our most challenging initiatives, particularly the work in regions where cultural or religious norms made conversations about relationship violence especially difficult. After the meeting, Adam found me in our shared garden, the connecting space between our separate homes that had become a physical manifestation of our relationship philosophy, intimately connected yet respecting individual boundaries. "You seem contemplative," he observed, settling beside me on the bench beneath the flowering desert willow. "Everything okay?" I nodded, watching hummingbirds dart among the blossoms. "I visited a forest in New Hampshire before coming home," I told him. "First time since, well, you know." His expression registered surprise, then understanding. "How was it?" "Healing," I replied simply. "Completing a circle somehow. I've spent 15 years helping others escape burial, but I needed to make peace with the earth itself." Adam took my hand, his touch familiar and comforting. "The nomination has stirred things up," he noted, "brought the past back into focus." "Yes," I agreed, "but in a new way. I'm thinking about legacy now. What happens to this work beyond us? How it continues to evolve?" This was the question that had been forming since hearing about the Nobel nomination. Not just what we had built, but how it would live beyond us. How the understanding of burial and liberation would continue to deepen, to address forms of erasure we hadn't yet recognized. Over the following months, as October and the Nobel announcement approached, I found myself increasingly focused on this question of legacy. The original vision, helping women recognize and resist being buried in relationships, had already expanded far beyond its initial scope. What was the next evolution? What were we still not seeing? The answer began to emerge through conversations with the next generation of leaders within the organization, younger women and men bringing fresh perspectives to the work. Alicia, who directed our youth programs, challenged me during a strategy session. "We talk about being unburied as if it's a one-time event," she pointed out. "You get free, you heal, you help others. But what about ongoing burial? The ways systems continue to cover us even after we've escaped individual relationships?" Her question resonated deeply. I thought about the women in the Phoenix program, liberated from abusive partners, but buried by the criminal justice system. About women in corporate settings who escaped controlling relationships only to face institutional sexism that limited their advancement. About myself, free from Daniel, yet still navigating a world where women's authority was often questioned, their experiences minimized. "You're right," I acknowledged. "We need to address the ongoing nature of burial, how it happens at multiple levels simultaneously, how liberation must be equally multidimensional." This insight led to a significant shift in our approach, culminating in a new framework we called continuous liberation. Rather than presenting freedom from burial as a destination, we began teaching it as a practice, ongoing awareness of and resistance to the many layers of erasure operating in our lives. The framework resonated powerfully across our programs. In prisons, it helped women recognize how they could practice liberation even within confinement. In schools, it showed teenagers how to maintain authentic selves despite peer pressure. In corporate settings, it offered tools for preserving voice and agency within hierarchical structures. By the time October arrived, this evolution in our work felt more significant than any external recognition. When the call came from the Nobel Committee in the pre-dawn hours of an autumn morning, Adam and I received the news together, sitting on our connecting porch with mugs of steaming tea. The Nobel Peace Prize for this year is awarded to the Unburied Project and its founder, Maya Reynolds, for pioneering approaches to preventing gender-based violence and transforming patterns of control into cultures of mutual empowerment worldwide. Adam squeezed my hand as the committee representative continued, detailing the impact of our work across continents, the measurable reductions in violence rates, the paradigm shift in how relationship education was approached globally. When the call ended, we sat in silence for several minutes, watching the sun begin to illuminate the red rocks. Finally, Adam spoke. "How does it feel?" I considered the question carefully, checking in with myself as I'd learned to do through years of healing work. "Like a validation of everyone who has contributed to this work," I replied. "The survivors who shared their stories, the facilitators who brought the curriculum to their communities, the researchers who documented the outcomes. This belongs to all of them." In the weeks that followed, preparations for the ceremony in Oslo consumed much of my attention. But even amid the whirlwind of logistics, press conferences, and congratulatory messages, I maintained my daily practice of reflection, the quiet moments that kept me grounded in the true purpose of our work. The night before leaving for Norway, I returned to my canyon viewpoint, the place that had witnessed so many turning points in my journey. The December air was crisp, the stars brilliant against the desert sky. I thought about the woman I had been 15 years ago, broken, angry, struggling to make meaning from the unimaginable trauma of being buried alive. That woman could never have envisioned standing on a stage in Oslo, accepting a Nobel Prize. But she had possessed something essential that made it all possible, the unshakable conviction that no one deserved to be buried, literally or figuratively. That every human being had the right to stand in their full truth, unsilenced and unafraid. The Nobel ceremony itself passed in a blur of formal attire, diplomatic protocol, and solemn tradition. Seated in the Grand Hall, surrounded by world leaders and previous laureates, I felt both the weight of responsibility and the lightness of validation. When my name was called, I walked to the podium with steady steps, accepting the medal and certificate with hands that had once clawed through earth toward survival. My acceptance speech began not with my own story, but with the stories of others. The women in prisons who had transformed their trauma into teaching, the teenagers who had recognized control before it became abuse, the communities that had dramatically reduced violence rates through implementing our programs. The true power of the Unburied Project, I told the assembled dignitaries and the millions watching worldwide, lies not in what one survivor accomplished after escaping a literal grave. It lies in the recognition that burial happens in countless ways at every level of society, and that liberation must be equally comprehensive. I spoke of our newest framework, continuous liberation, and its application across contexts. Of the next generation of leaders emerging within the movement, bringing fresh insights and approaches. Of the work still to be done in communities where the most basic concepts of autonomy and mutual respect remained revolutionary. The man who buried me alive 15 years ago intended my voice to be silenced forever, I concluded. Instead, that act of violence ultimately amplified not just my voice, but the voices of countless others who had been buried in less visible but equally devastating ways. This award belongs to all those voices, past, present, and future, rising from the earth to create a world where no one remains buried alive. The standing ovation that followed felt less like personal acclaim and more like collective recognition, acknowledgement of a truth that resonated across cultures, genders, and experiences. The truth that burial, in all its forms, violated something fundamental about human dignity, and that liberation was not just possible, but necessary for genuine peace. In the days after the ceremony, as Adam and I participated in the various events associated with Nobel Week, I found unexpected moments of connection with other laureates, physicists, economists, writers whose work seemed far removed from relationship violence prevention. Yet in our conversations, common themes emerged: the search for truth, the courage to challenge established patterns, the belief that human systems could evolve toward greater wholeness. On our final evening in Oslo, we walked along the harbor, snowflakes drifting gently around us. The Nobel medal rested in a secure location, but its significance traveled with me, not as a personal achievement, but as a milestone in a movement that had grown far beyond my individual experience. "What's next?" Adam asked as we paused to watch lights reflecting on the dark water. "After this recognition, this platform, where does the work go from here?" I smiled, grateful for a partner who understood that endings were always new beginnings, that achievement was just a doorway to the next challenge. "Deeper," I replied. "We go deeper into understanding how burial operates at the most fundamental levels of human interaction. How liberation can become not just a response to trauma, but a preventative practice taught from earliest childhood." As we continued walking, arm in arm against the cold, I felt a profound sense of rightness, not just about the Nobel recognition, but about the entire journey that had led to this moment. From the desperate fight for breath beneath the forest floor, to this peaceful harbor half a world away. From one woman's survival to a global movement for transformation. The man who buried me had intended the earth to be my ending. Instead, it had become my beginning. The foundation from which I had built not just a new life, but a new understanding of what life could be when freed from the weight of control, silencing, erasure. As snowflakes melted against my upturned face, I silently renewed the promise I had made years before, to continue this work of liberation for as long as I had breath, to ensure that the grave meant to silence me would instead give voice to countless others buried in countless ways. The Nobel Peace Prize was not an endpoint, but a waymarker on a journey that would continue long after my own story ended. A journey toward a world where being buried alive, in any sense, was no longer an acceptable risk of being human. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.